Hello, Internet. I'm Jackie Fox, and for this week's chapter of Final Fantasy and Philosophy, we're going to be circling back to Chapter 2, Kefka, Nietzsche, Foucault, Madness and Nihilism in Final Fantasy VI, by Kylie Primus. What are your values? They are peace, freedom, prosperity, wealth, and so on and so forth. So that any man who should, for instance, openly and knowingly act contrary to the whole of that list would, in your opinion, and in mine too, for that matter, be an obscurantinist. Or a plain madman, wouldn't he? Fyodor Dostoevsky, Notes from Underground. A Kefka-esque beginning. Kefka. Mere mention of the name conjures up the faint sound of synthesized laughter to the ears of those who have played Final Fantasy VI. The name, of course, is also an allusion to Franz Kefka, 1883 to 1924, a philosophical writer well known for his twisted and unsettling perspectives on the world. One of the most infamous villains of the Final Fantasy multiverse, Kefka Palazzo, is one of the most philosophically dense characters in video gaming lore. Despite his court gesture attire and comic demeanor, Kefka is quite deliberate in enacting his goal of world destruction. He finds no meaning in the universe and sees eradication of all forms of existence as his only reason for being. But is Kefka truly mad? Or are we simply unequipped to label a man with such wide-ranging homicidal tendencies in any other way? Kefka, the man behind the laugh. We first meet Kefka and the MIDI tones of his infamous laugh at the gates of Figaro Castle, where he has come in search of a strange woman named Terra. Unbeknownst to us at the time, Terra, a half-human, half-esper hybrid, is one of the few people alive capable of controlling magic innately. Kefka is under orders from Emperor Gestahl to acquire her for the good of the Empire. Whether they intend to use her for research or exploit her as a war machine is unclear. Even at this initial stage of the game, Kefka's sanity is questioned by the game's main protagonist, Locke. Later that evening, when Kefka attempts to burn the castle to the ground as a result of King Edgar's evasiveness, we witness his penchant for mass homicide. What we are not told until later in the story is that Kefka's behavior is a result of experiments done on him years earlier in an attempt to infuse humans with magical ability. Magic had all but disappeared from the world a millennium ago, when the three gods of magic ended a violent and bloody conflict with one another by willingly turning themselves to stone. The magical soldiers they had created, espers, retreated to a separate part of the world and were gradually forgotten by mankind. Technology replaced magic as both tools of convenience and weapons of war, until Emperor Gestahl began research into magitech, a way to combine ancient magic with modern machinery. The only way to create magitech, or for humans to wield magic, is through the acquisition of magicite, the rare remains of deceased espers. In an effort to fight the Emperor's dependence on rare artifacts for magical power, attempts were made to infuse human beings with magicite. An adolescent Kefka was one of the first test subjects, and it granted him the ability to wield some magical power, but it also affected a gradual change in his behavior that it is easy to characterize as insane, as we see for the first time at Figaro Castle. We catch up with Kefka again during the siege of Doma Castle. By this point, even his soldiers are wary of him, and after the general in charge is called away, Kefka takes matters into his own hands. Here, the full extent of his murderous impulse becomes clear as he orders the entire castle's water supply poisoned, resulting in the death of nearly everyone inside, including some of the Empire's own troops who had been captured and imprisoned. Nothing can beat the music of hundreds of voices screaming in unison. Kefka yells in glee. It appears that there is little left for us to do other than write him off as a deranged and archetypal criminal antagonist, the homicidal maniac. Foucault, the method to his madness. There is no question that Kefka is homicidal, but is he truly mad? Enter Michel Foucault, 1926 to 1984, a French philosopher who bore a striking resemblance to Uncle Fester. It's an interesting little aside there. Underneath the turtleneck and the shiny pate? I don't know. However, lay a man deeply concerned with the historical forces that have shaped modern-day structures of power. His first major work, Madness and Civilization, The History of Insanity in the Age of Reason, published in 1961, charts the history of the concept insane, and how the label is applied to the less desirable members of society as a way of controlling them. Although not initially a term of moral disapprobation, it has come to suggest a willful failure of not only the logical but moral faculties, from the inability to be productive in society to the downright desire to engage in reprehensible acts. Labels are powerful things. Forget the common mantra that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Labels create social hierarchies that can invoke affirmation or condemnation depending on their use. It is little wonder, for example, that Locke prefers to be called a treasure hunter rather than a thief. Labeling people as mad, according to Foucault, filled a space at the end of the Middle Ages once occupied by lepers. Leprosy was thought to be a disease not only from the body but also of the soul, as many believed it to be a curse from God for moral depravity. The construction of leper colonies gave the rest of society a sense of safety and superiority. No matter how downtrodden your lot, at least you weren't a leper. But constant quarantining led to the virtual disappearance of leprosy in Europe. A new group of outcasts was needed to give the general public peace of mind. The unfortunate targets of this restructuring were the insane. To isolate the mad, 15th century artists rendered them as cargo on a ship of fools, sailing just outside the city's borders with no direction and no greater purpose. Prior to this change, during the Middle Ages, the common characteristics of madness were often thought to be signs of a veiled wisdom. Foucault noted that the older image of madness still persisted in literature after the Middle Ages. Think of Don Quixote or Hamlet's gravediggers. Even the heroes of our tale are no strangers to madness in their midst. Both the eccentric old magician Strago and the quirky but wise Moogles are examples of an older, more positive notion of madness. Even more telling for our purposes is Foucault's conviction that the transformation from insanity as veiled wisdom to madness as cultural fear begins with Christian views of the apocalypse. Biblical allusions to the human inability to comprehend the reason of God are taken to imply that those who come too close to such an understanding will be driven insane. By the 17th century, madmen were feared because it was supposed that they were driven crazy by stumbling upon the hidden secrets of the universe and the coming apocalypse. If we take this symbolism and understanding of madness to heart, then the process of infusing Kefka with magicite may have given him a revelation of dark secrets and visions of the apocalypse, knowledge that no human could comprehend. In the world of Final Fantasy VI, magic was controlled by 3 gods who removed themselves from the world, spawning an era of peace and tranquility that lasted 1,000 years. With the rediscovery of magic, this peace is threatened. The fear of what would happen if these gods of magic should return gives rise to the notion of madness in the game. In much the same way as the fear of Christian apocalypse created the label of madness at the end of the Middle Ages. Kefka is quickly labeled mad because those around him fear the knowledge he may possess. The Age of Unreason. In the 18th century, the dawn of the Age of Enlightenment was heralded as the solution to all of humanity's problems. Foucault contended that nothing was more of a threat to humanity at this time than those who refused to employ reason. Madness became the very antithesis of reason. Philosophers like Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, even went so far as to provide us with the purely rational justifications for morality. So naturally, those whose capacities for reason were flawed came to be viewed as morally corrupt. Foucault marked this period as the Great Confinement, or the birth of the insane asylum. The insane were locked away for the betterment of society, treated little differently than criminals, even if they had committed no criminal acts. From this point onward, madness and depravity were inextricably linked. The marriage of these two concepts create a set of familiar archetypes: the criminally insane, the violently deranged, and the homicidal maniac. Players are quite comfortable giving Kefka such labels. Few of the protagonists attempt to reason with him, and certainly none desire to understand him. Any attempt he makes to persuade us of his position is ignored and invalidated. His arguments are routinely dismissed with a common logical fallacy, an ad hominem, or appeal to the person. This fallacy involves referencing some aspect of a person's character as defective or undesirable, rather than criticizing the logic as defective or undesirable, rather than criticizing the logic of the person's argument. A common use of this fallacy is to say, "You're crazy," implying that nothing of what you argue could be logically valid. Good reason, however, stands on its own. Twice 2 makes 4 is a sound statement whether I am perfectly rational or certifiably insane. During the Great Confinement, however, there was no attempt to understand those who were locked up, just as we have no desire to understand Kefka. The insane were simply locked away and forgotten, just punished for their perceived moral transgressions. We are definitely justified in locking up Kefka. He is most definitely homicidal. But what evidence do we have that he is insane? There is a method to his madness, as Polonius would say of Hamlet. The poisoning of Doma was the most efficient and effective way of ending the siege swiftly and with a minimal loss of imperial life. What is so unreasonable about that? In fact, before the story ends, Kefka amasses divine power and finds that there is no ultimate meaning to the world's existence. He thus sets out to destroy it. If there were no purpose, no reason, then why should the world exist at all? This fundamental logic is the basis for the philosophical movement of existentialism, which we will return to shortly when we discuss the work of Nietzsche. Existentialism arose as a response to the Age of Enlightenment, proposing that logic cannot provide meaning to the world, so we must seek it elsewhere. If Kefka suffers from anything, perhaps it is not too little reason, but too much. When he achieves the height of all rational power available to humans and the gods, he suddenly finds no justification for life at all. God is dead. Long live Kefka. The main theme of madness and civilization permeates all of Foucault's work. Society has a desire for control, and that which it cannot control, it seeks to dismiss. The very concept of madness has become a tool of dismissal and control. As we saw, labeling Kefka as mad is really just an attempt to ignore what may be a valid point of view. Now, let's take a more serious look at how he acquired that view and what it entails. After the massacre at Doma, we find Kefka at the Imperial Magitech Research Lab trying to coax magical power out of live espers that the Empire has captured. Learning that magicite is actually the remains of dead espers, he proceeds to kill them all, an act that disgusts his adoptive father Sid, a perennial Final Fantasy favorite, and the inventor of Magitech. Through a complex scheme of manipulation, Kefka convinces Emperor Gestal and our heroes to find and open the sealed door to the land of the Espers, whereupon he makes his final grab for power, killing the Emperor and draining all magical power from the petrified gods of magic. This results in a cataclysm that shatters the world and makes Kefka a god himself. In true arch-villain fashion, he builds a mighty tower within which he rules over all, doling out punishment at will and destroying entire towns that refuse allegiance to him. By all rights, Kefka has achieved his goal, ultimate power and ultimate knowledge, and will be content to roll over all of life for eternity. When our varied band of protagonists finally manages to organize a resistance and scale Kefka's tower to confront him face to face, they find that he has undergone an interesting metamorphosis. No longer garbed in jester robes or keen on snappy one-liners, he has instead taken on a winged, angelic form, and his attitude is one of detached stoicism. The power and knowledge of the gods have changed him such that, to our horror, he no longer desires to simply rule over all, but would rather destroy everything, creating a paradoxical monument to non-existence. By this way of explanation, Kefka says that there is no meaning to the world, no reason that justifies its existence, so he will destroy it entirely. While ascending the tower for the final confrontation, our heroes attempt to argue against Kefka and explain to him what gives them their own lives meaning. Cyan lives to carry the memory of his family. Shadow has come to value friendship. Edgar wants to create a kingdom where people are free. These explanations fall on deaf ears, however, for Kefka is no longer subject to logic or reason. To be clear, though, he has not become unreasonable or illogical. Instead, Kefka's goals have become irrational, not contrary to reason, but outside of the realm of reason entirely. Our hero's mistake as they attempt to sway Kefka from his nihilistic plan is thinking that a meaning, a goal, a purpose for life is something that one can be convinced of. Although they each have motivating desires are particular to each individual. They may hope that Kefka shares those desires, but if he does not, there is no amount of logic that will get him to agree on their importance. Most of us see existence as necessary, as an imperative. Kefka understands that this is not so, that existence is really only what philosophers call a hypothetical imperative. A hypothetical imperative is something that one should do or believe if one wishes to attain some further goal. In other words, it would simply be irrational not to follow a certain course of action if you have a particular end in mind. For example, I might say that you should unlock the secret characters of Gogo and Umaro as you play through Final Fantasy VI. My reasons for this may be based on a desire for completeness, or perhaps on the strengths that those characters possess that make the game easier. These reasons assume that you care about completing every element of the game, or that you don't want the game to be overly difficult. Hypothetically, if you desire these things, then it is logically imperative for you to unlock these characters. But if you care for neither completeness nor ease, then these arguments, regardless of how well I construct them, will not convince you. Similarly, our heroes, trying to convince Kefka that existence is imperative, invoke hypothetical desires that Kefka lacks. Therefore, without a reason that justifies the continued existence of the world, Kefka sees no alternative other than to effect its complete destruction. Nietzsche, the meaning of morality in the world of ruin. What a character. Kefka seems to personify exactly the sort of nihilistic, cynical, life is meaningless attitude that people might associate with philosophers. Existentialist philosophers, to be precise. This, however, would be a gross oversimplification. The existentialist movement, represented by writers such as Fyodor Dostoevsky, 1821 to 1888, Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900, and Jean-Paul Sartre, 1905 to 1980. Didn't realize he was that much of a contemporary. More accurately express a belief that while life may lack an objective purpose, We are each born into the world with the ability to decide for ourselves what is meaningful. Nietzsche, in fact, recognized the potential dangers of a nihilistic outlook, particularly in a world that rejects God. Yet, he also saw in this the potential for an even greater justification for existence than philosophers had ever given before. Sporting a mustache that would turn cyan green with envy, Nietzsche greatly influenced Foucault by employing the method of historically investigating concepts to better understand their modern meanings. Nietzsche called this process of outlining a genealogy, the most famous example of which is on the Genealogy of Morals, which explores the evolution of morality, perhaps surprisingly. Our understanding of Kefka can shed some light on the connections between Nietzsche's famous dictum, God is dead, and the inherent meaninglessness of morality in existence, and the concept of the Übermensch, or Nietzschean Superman. The moral history Nietzsche traces in the genealogy documents the fate of two separate notions of good. Good in the sense of superior, good versus bad, and moral good, good versus evil. Long ago, when the world was neatly divided between the noble, knightly, and aristocratic classes and the hard-working lower class, good was a term the nobility used to refer to themselves. They alone were fortunate enough to be endowed with intelligence, strength, and wealth. They looked down with pity, not hatred, on the lower class. The lower members of society were bad, only in the sense that they were not good. Their badness was relative, in much the same way that most weapons might be considered bad when compared to the Masamune. Inferior, but not morally evil. Kefka's relationship with the rest of humanity and Moogledom can be described this way. He feels no animosity towards our protagonists. After his ascent to godhood, he utters not a word of hatred towards them. The same cannot be said of our hero's opinion of Kefka. For most people, Kefka represents the living embodiment of evil. What is evil, though? According to the genealogy, over time, especially with the advent of Christianity, the lower classes began to resent being looked at with pity and being abused by the nobility. So, the downtrodden started a gradual change in the definition of the word good. Rather than being a self-evident concept meaning superior, efficient, or top of the line, the lowly redefined good as the opposite of evil. So everything that the nobility cherish and hold dear is evil, and good becomes the opposite. The nobility are seen as strong, so meekness becomes a virtue. The nobility have pride, so humility is now desirable. Poverty is a blessing that builds character. Compassion and altruism, which the nobility have no use for, at least when it concerns the lower class, become the cornerstone of the moral life. In time, these ideas take hold in the hearts and minds of all of humanity, and the distinction between good and evil is born. Nietzsche calls this transition in the meaning of good the slave revolt, and the resulting moral norms which exist to this day, slave morality. Okay. So perhaps if we are quick to define Kefka as evil, it is only because we too think in terms of slave morality. The scarred and chaotic world that exists after Kefka acquires his power is in many ways the direct result of the slave morality. Kefka punishing those who refuse to accept that he, as God, is good, and that they are inferior, though not evil. If they would simply accept this state of affairs without complaint, without trying to repel against him or label him, he would most likely let them be. They beg for compassion, but compassion is something that Kefka lacks, has always lacked, simply because it is a virtue created by those who lack power, and virtue is rationally unnecessary for superiority, or goodness, in the original state of master morality. Neo-Kefka. Übermensch or failed god. Nietzsche imagined that at some point in the future, the contradictory nature of the slave morality would become apparent and the superior individuals would arise, creating a new morality of self-governance. Note that this new morality could not be called better or worse, for what moral system can be used to judge other moral systems themselves? Would we recognize such a superior person, an Übermensch, if we saw one? And is Kefka an Übermensch? While Nietzsche must be known for the dictum God is dead, he did not mean the phrase as literally as many people think. The death of God signifies the end of an era in which the meaning of life is accepted unquestioningly from a religious or other authority that gained power during the slave revolt. Uncertainty about what will fill the void of meaning created by the authorities' collapse leads most people to close their minds to the thought. At one point, Nietzsche has the character who proclaims the death of God, interestingly enough a madman, give up and smash his lantern to the ground, declaring that he has come too soon and the world is not yet ready to face the consequences of a new, godless existence. The lack of preparedness is the very worry that Kefka embodies, that without God there is no purpose or meaning to existence. Our fear is that in a world in which God has been cast aside or replaced by reason alone, is one where the only possible end is the nihilistic desire for the annihilation of everything. Kefka's failure to justify the meaning of existence shows us that this fear is still as strong 100 years after Nietzsche made us aware of it. If Kefka could not discover a meaning despite his knowledge and power, what hope is there for the rest of us? Nietzsche wanted more than what Kefka could offer mankind. The Übermensch he described might initially resemble Kefka, but ultimately it shows him to be a false prophet. The real Übermensch is capable not only of dethroning God, not only capable of overthrowing God and the old morality, but of overcoming nihilism as well. This man of the future, who will redeem us not from the hitherto reigning ideal, but also from that which was bound to grow out of it, the great nausea, the will to nothingness, nihilism. This, Antichrist and anti-nihilist. Is reason really madness? Was Kefka truly mad? Or did he cause a change for the better in the world? At the conclusion of the game, amid the various happily ever afters and credits, we find a party of characters who have learned a great deal about themselves and how to live in the world. Although they may have lived satisfactory lives before, they were unenlightened and questioned nothing. The struggle against Kefka brought them face to face with the negative influence of magic, of religion, control, and authority, and tasked them with learning to live without it. Perhaps some may think that an ideal world is one in which the gods of magic remained frozen, or where a benevolent ruler usurped their power and handed down a new meaning that would bring us peace, prosperity, and purpose. If what Nietzsche said as the ring of truth, however, then Kefka's rise and fall represent the best possible situation. In the end, a world without magic is not entirely blissful. It is not utopian, but neither should we expect it to be. Our heroes will struggle in this new world, but their biggest struggle will also be the most rewarding. For it is the banner under which philosophers have always served, the struggle to find new meaning where none is given. Nice. So, I don't think I have read chapter 11, but it's mentioned in the notes for this chapter. I have read chapter 12 for you guys, though, which it references when it was talking about Nietzsche's response to the death of God. That would be in Human All Too Human, and if I remember, I will link that in the description. Also in the description, you will find a Linktree link that goes any number of places within the Jackie Fox media empire. There are podcasts, video channels, all sorts of things. You can say thank you to the channel by sending money, always appreciated, or you could just like and subscribe right here, right now. No matter what you decide to do, thank you. And I'll see you in the next one.